This episode is sponsored by The Power of You, a leadership resource for entrepreneurs, solopreneurs, and anyone intent on developing their leadership impact and supercharging their career. For more information, check the podcast webpage or show notes. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Soul of Business with Blaine Bartlett. I am your host, Blaine Bartlett. Folks, and I'm going to, actually put a date in here right now. And I know that this, the intent in large part with these podcast episodes is to have them be kind of a greenfield thing where they're not constrained by dates. But I do want to mention this. I was actually back in NASDAQ and back in New York last week. I'd been asked to give a talk at NASDAQ headquarters as part of an IPO summit. And the reason I'm mentioning that has to do with just the nature of employee engagement. And specifically when we're looking at scaling a business, who gets left behind? Why do they get left behind? So those sorts of questions are are some of the questions that I actually addressed when we were convening in New York last week, I guess it was. You won't know what week I'm talking about here as you're listening to this, but that's irrelevant. The point being, from a leadership perspective, if you look at what's required from leaders, and we're going to have two aspects on this: what's required of leaders, but also what's required of employees. When you begin to scale and grow a business, moving beyond just the founding kernel that is the company, the business, as it begins to grow and express itself fully, leaders can't just afford to continuously be better at what they're doing, because better only gets them more of what they got. And as Marshall Goldsmith one time said, "What got me here won't get me there." And there being some ideal place out there in the future that I'd like to move myself and my organization to. Leaders have to be different if they're going to effectively scale their organization. And it's that question of, how do I be different? What does different actually look like? That really informs the conversation we're going to have today with my two guests. Nick Smallman founded the company that he heads up right now in 1998, and the company's called Working Voices. Now, and I love that title, just the name of the company, Working Voices. The notion of working voices is a very interesting noticing use of language here. How I describe something determines how I experience it, and how I experience it determines my behavior. Working voices. How do we bring things into play using our voices? And voice is not just the linguistic structure, but when I speak with my body. I speak with my energetic field. There's a way that I move through an organization that has impact. There's a mindset that I hold that either invites exploration and expansion, or it invites contraction and compliance. And those elements come into play very strongly when we look at how do we begin to scale our organizations and keep them healthy and moving from surviving to thriving. Dan Parry is the head of communication at Working Voices, and they have together written a book that, as I understand it, was kind of formulated in your mind, Nick, and then in collaboration with Dan, you actually were able to put pen to paper and, kind of metaphorically here, keystrokes to bits and bytes on the screen. But a book came out of that, and this book is absolutely fascinating. And those of you that are watching the video rather than just listening, I'm going to hold this up because I want you to get a copy of it. Engaging Teams: How to Use Social Well-Being to Boost Performance, Retention, and Culture. And I want to underline the term there, social well-being. That's a whole interesting area that I think we can explore, that has to do with how people feel about themselves when they're in the presence of the organization, when they come to work. How do they feel about themselves? And that is a key question that I think leaders really need to address on an ongoing and conscious basis. So, gentlemen, I want to, with that long preamble, I want to just welcome you to the show, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks, Blaine. It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you, Blaine. Nice to see you.
Good. First of all, just the idea of engaging teams. I know that Gallup has done a survey that on employee engagement for at least 25 years that I'm aware of. And it consistently shows that employee disengagement globally averages between 90 or 80, 87 to 93%. It kind of bounces in that 5-point window. 87% to 93% of folks are emotionally disengaged at some level from their work. And companies spend about 42 billion annually, according to McKinsey, 42 billion annually on leadership development with the intent of moving the needle on employee engagement. And in 25 years, it's not moved. So we're getting something wrong in how we actually develop leaders in organizations. So, with that as kind of a contextual backdrop, I'd like to just kind of, open the door here. What do you see are some of the major, and I'll just kind of field this question to both of you. What do you see as some of the major reasons that worker disengagement has not improved in 25 years, at least since we've been measuring it? What's going on?
Well, thanks for teeing that up. It's a huge question that Dan and I grappled with for 2 or 3 years. To give a bit of context, we started to talk about this just after COVID hit everybody. And obviously the world changed quite dramatically. And we started to look into, how people were coping. But what we realized once we started to dig into the numbers was that the challenges around disengagement was not a COVID thing. COVID just kind of revealed it a little bit because people were working from home and, you've heard of the Great Resignation and the Great Reflection and all that kind of stuff. And we started to see some really interesting patterns. And what we found was that disengagement, certainly from our research, has certainly been around since probably the Great Recession. And we kind of wanted to crystallize what that looked like. And so we found sort of 4 drivers that we found was causing this disengagement. And the first one, which I think anyone listening to this who runs a business, especially a big business, will relate to, is this idea of doing more with less. Efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. Now, efficiency is great. We all like to see efficient everything. The problem with efficiency, when it starts to squeeze humans, is humans can start to feel a bit overwhelmed. They can start to feel a little resentful. Like, a really good example is somebody removes somebody, fires somebody from a particular organization, and then asks their co-worker to pick up the slack. Yeah. And the co-worker's going, well, hold on a second, you're going to pay me extra? Oh, no, we just need you to do their work for them, or they might split the work. So people take on more, so that whole idea of doing more with less. So that becomes an issue. And I've been doing this for 27 years, so I've noticed post the Great Recession that this phrase started to creep into most conversations that I was kind of party to. And it happened a lot with our business. We run a training business, a lot of leadership development. And we noticed that our clients were very much saying, well, how can we do this more efficiently? Not what's the best way of doing it, but how do we save money? Because I think post 2008, accountants were leaning on all aspects of the business to make sure that people were fiscally very, very disciplined.
Yeah. It's interesting if I could just make a comment here, Nick. Yeah, you guys are based in the UK. I'm here in the US, and efficiency has been in the lexicon ever since January of this year when Trump came into play and brought in Elon Musk. And you write in the book a bit about Elon's tenure when he first came into Twitter. And in the name of efficiency, started doing all kinds of hundreds of people, thousands of people ended up leaving. To your point, the treatment, the human component to that was not present. And to your point, I think, Nick, and it's very well made, is that there's an emotional consequence of that. When to those that are left behind, survivor syndrome comes into play, that sort of thing. Also guilt. Why didn't I speak up or do something? I mean, all of that stuff starts to get bundled into this. So I want to mark that up because, I've been working in business for 40 plus years now. And efficiency has been in place in some way, shape, or form. I mean, I've done consulting work. I've done work with McKinsey, with Bain, when we were doing SAP rollouts and we did SAP because efficiency was what we were after. The human consequence was never really calculated. It was never really brought into the formulaic business case for why we're doing this. And as a consequence, I mean, SAP was a great example of this. It was horrendously difficult to implement because people did not buy in. They understood the business case, but they didn't buy in at the human level. And incredibly expensive in the delays and everything else that were caused as a consequence of that. So I really appreciate you marking out this number one area as being this focus on efficiency, as opposed to what's the best workable solution here, not what's the most efficient. And there's a big difference between those two.
In fact, there are the areas that we've just been covering. Actually, we split that into two causes. So as Nick was saying, we have four altogether. We've been covering two pretty much. The first one, as Nick says, was doing more with less. So that is people either losing their jobs or else they're staying behind and they're having to cover up and pick up more work for cover other people who are no longer there. And so that was certainly the case right after the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and thereabouts. But that continued in the years that followed. The second point that comes with that is, Blaine, just as you were touching on there about efficiency, and this sense that where you increase the efficiency by doing things such as not wanting people to talk to each other very much, not having water cooler moments, not having breaks between back-to-back meetings online, not having a sense of people going, a social sense of maybe going for a drink after work on a Friday, that way things used to be. There's less of that. That leads to our second cause, which we explained as creating a workplace that is less human than is healthy. So those are two of our four causes.
And just to sort of add to that, Blaine, it's kind of counterproductive to suppress natural human ebullience. Yeah, absolutely. But I think the problem is it depends how you view the human in the workforce. I mean, Dan and I have experienced clients who've said, we don't really care if people are having a good time as long as they do their job. And what we've noticed is when you give people access to learning, to creativity, to moments that sort of decompress people from work, that's when actually some of their best traits, some of their most exciting ideas can come to the fore. So although people may say, you're just wasting time doing this water cooler stuff, actually it's fueling a lot of the creative juices, etc. So a really good example is if you're trying to make a meeting psychologically safe, you've got to have moments where people are kind of getting to know each other, understanding each other, appreciating each other, empathizing with one another. Those kinds of ingredients are core components to people feeling confident. If you're confident, then that intellectual capital that's locked away in your brain can come to the fore. Yeah. And that's kind of one of the core principles, really, that we're trying to get across in the book, that far from being a distraction, this kind of very, very sort of human-centric environment and behavior is integral to a prosperous and successful working environment.
Yeah, you hit on something that I think is really interesting there, Nick, and I'd be interested in both of your perspectives on this as we look at a workplace that values humanity. I mean, and I'll just kind of preface this with, we've all heard the phrase, "Our people are our greatest resource," or the other variation on that, "People are our greatest asset." Mm-hmm. Well, resources are meant to be used. Assets are depreciated on a balance sheet. So people, if this is the mindset that's in place with the leaders and the managers in the organization, they do exactly as you're talking to here, use people as disposable resources. If you don't do your job, we'll get somebody else that can. You're just a cog in a wheel. And the other piece has to do with the depreciation component. People do tend to feel depreciated at work because they're used all the time. So where I go with this, and this is the interesting piece that you just talk about in terms of psychological safety. I came up with a little model years ago where in this is how do we access creativity and innovation? Well, it begins with trust and safety. Both of those components have to be there, oftentimes in equal parts. Safety is generated out of a sense of familiarity and intimacy with what's required of me, who am I, where do I belong, those sorts of things, so that I can just kind of settle a little bit. I feel safe. If I feel safe, I feel very free in terms of my behavior set, what I'm willing to explore, what I'm willing to voice, those sorts of things. So safety, intimacy, familiarity generates that sense of freedom. And that's what we want to have. Freedom is a freedom of behavior, behavioral freedom, which another word for it is autonomy. And I think you guys speak to this in the book as well. But when people feel that they have autonomy in their workplace environment, creativity is unleashed, innovation comes to the forefront. They start, and they actually feel willing to say no to something. And if I'm willing to say no, and it's heard as a valuable, conversation, no is a complete sentence, sort of a thing here. The person that I'm saying no to values me being willing to say no, and as a consequence, I feel valued. I feel that, okay, I can be heard here. And that generates a whole, experience of safety and freedom that now we can explore, alternatives. So I'm just marking that out here when we're looking at humanity, because I want to move into, it's natural progression here, for me at least, a natural progression is into the area of autonomy, worker autonomy, employee autonomy. How does that come in? Because that is one of the 4 points that you identified, I believe. How does that come into play?
Nick, or let me take that. Okay. We were, let me just set that up. We were talking about our 4 principal causes. We covered 2 already. We talked about lack of, doing more with less, and lack of workplace humanity. There were 2 other causes that were very important to us. Maybe I take one, Nick take the other. One was, in answer to your question, was a lack of employee autonomy, that over time there was a development of technical processes and technical hardware, and we come on to that in a second. But one net effect of that was, for example, if you have lots of different apps and in your workplace and you have to jump from one app to the next, some of these apps might be even measuring what you're doing per hour. You have to report each hour what you're doing. You're spending more time, days per month, working with their apps, and you're not really doing as you might want to do for yourself. Your own work at home might be monitored by spyware and monitoring keystrokes. These sorts of things come from an overarching attitude, or when these sorts of things come from an overarching attitude that constrains people and creates conformity and even a degree of fear, there is little autonomy, little freedom to do as you want, little opportunity to offer creative solutions and great ideas and all the sorts of things that you might want to rely on your people, especially in times of uncertainty. And I guess we come on to that a little later on. But that's our 3rd one, which is autonomy. And we had a 4th cause as well, which was the rise of tech.
Yeah.
Nick,
I mean, this to me is the one that's going to dominate.
Yes.
In the next 5 to 10 years, simply because I don't really think that people understand a lot of the time, and especially speaking to our clients who are the thing about, we've got a lot of corporate clients, global corporate clients. They're very big and unwieldy, and when it comes to getting things done, it can take time. So, for example, the stuff they're doing now was probably planned 9 months ago.
Yeah,
but AI is going to remake the workplace in so many ways. And obviously, AI is a tool to help people do more with less. Obviously, it's a way of saving money and making money. But I think there is going to be a knock-on human consequence to the use of AI that is going to make sometimes people feel a little scared. Like, is it going to take my job? And I think the consensus is it's not necessarily going to take your job, but you better be able to use AI in order to do your job. And if you can't, we'll find someone who can. That's one. But I think also there's that nagging feeling that AI just might make you feel a little bit redundant. as a human, because we know that these large language models now are incredibly powerful and they can start to do the jobs of intelligent human beings and do them in the blink of an eye. And also they don't need bathroom breaks, they don't need holidays, they don't get depressed, they don't need any sleep. It's very, very alluring for an organization to absolutely embrace AI, and I can totally understand why that happens. I'm not anti-AI. What I am concerned about is that there needs to be guardrails within organizations of how you use AI, because while you still have humans in your organization, you need to ring fence. You need to ring fence the human experience, because if you don't, that will come back to bite you as an organization. So you can't have psychological safety if everyone is kind of feeling anxious about the machines around them, because change is happening now and it's going to get faster.
Well, that brings up an interesting point for me in my thinking here. Yeah, the current work environment and practices that are in place in most organizations today. In your book, you talk about the symptomatic consequences of current work practices around fatigue being one of them, burnout being another. And a fatigue, we kind of address that when you're doing more with less. That's
you're always on. You're always on 24/7, emails.
Pick up the phone. Here's the text. The text, the email.
And the obligation to answer, because you better get it off your desk before, because it's all going to start again tomorrow. That's the thing.
Yeah, just the hamster wheel starts to come into play here.
Exactly.
Where does burnout begin to appear? Because I'll ask this question in this context. I do a lot of work in hospital systems, and with docs, with administrators, with nurses, and burnout is a very serious issue in the medical profession today. Not because docs are working harder, and this has been my experience. It's not because they're working harder or longer hours necessarily. It's because in the process of doing what they now need to do around reporting, around record keeping, around insurance compliance, just all of the stuff that takes them away from what they got into medicine in the first place to be doing. In your experience, and this is my experience of it, but I want to just check the validity of this. Burnout is a consequence of getting disconnected from meaning, from doing things that are meaningful. How does that land with your research and what it is that you've actually kind of assembled here as a case for what you're speaking about in terms of engaging teams?
Can maybe I would just take a step back just before we get to burnout, because I want to introduce a thing between the causes we were just talking about and burnout that we're moving on to, as well as the four causes. Big element of this. Of thinking about burnout, fatigue, and disengagement, are what we call 21st century lifestyles, or the impact of 21st century lifestyles. There's three things there that lead to burnout and that were fundamental to us and to Nick and the senior team in creating response through future skills. Those three things were consequences largely of tech, leading to challenges to mental health, to reducing attention spans, and to critical thinking. And when those three things are eroded by tech, you get to fatigue and burnout. And those are the three things that led to our focus on the future skills that Nick and the senior team then developed in response to that.
Great. So what are those future skills, Nick? And please feel free to add anything on to what Dan just spoke to.
Well, just to add to what Dan is saying, I mean, it's quite interesting. If someone who's listening to this is 25 or under, and we say, your senses are under assault, they probably won't know what we're talking about, because this is life. This is normal, right?
But grew up with this. Yeah.
We download so much information every day, way more than we did, say, in the 90s. We are intrinsically completely networked, as certainly in the Western world, we are networked completely by all of our technology. But it's relentless. And the thing is, where we used to be sort of looking at screens for our work, our home life was a time to decompress. Now we're looking at our phones constantly. I think I had a talk with some people recently, and I asked them, how much time do you spend looking at a screen? And they said, well, 10, 11 hours a day. We're not designed to do this. And also, if you to go to this idea of critical thinking, which I think is a really, really important part of the skills we need in the future. If you think about the idea that humans are constantly trying to make sense of things and make sense of their world, and if you have lots of messages coming at you repeatedly, your kind of goal is to get things resolved as quickly as possible. And so if you go back to someone like Daniel Kahneman and his work, Thinking Fast and Slow, he'll talk about those two systems. System one, which is like quick, reflexive, instinctive kind of thinking, and then the more slow, considered thinking. And because there's so much pressure now to get things done, that slow thinking maybe takes a little bit of a back seat. But if you're constantly doing the reflexive thinking, you're constantly going at a certain pace, I think people get burnout. I can only speak for myself here. I mean, running a business in the 21st century is hard, especially with very demanding clients. And I can tell you that it is relentless. And so one of the things we say to our clients is boundaries. If you are to feel psychologically safe, you need to be able to say to your boss, this is what I can handle. The work I'm doing, I'm sure you think is good, but this is what I can handle. And then it's about working together and collaborating. But just to move on to the skills, because we've been, teaching people all over the world these kind of core interpersonal skills, things like emotional intelligence, presenting, personal impact, influencing, that kind of thing. But what we realized kind of post-COVID was that there were a new set of skills that were kind of revealing themselves to us. So the first one wasn't just leadership. So you can lead people, for example, by giving them good feedback and having difficult conversations and having good executive presence. You can do that. But now we realize that real leadership in the sort of the 2020s was about leading people through change, because change is happening constantly. And if you can't do that, why would anyone follow you? Because management itself as an idea will be diminished over the next 10 years, because that's what AI is for. AI will do management roles. So what's left is leadership. So if you go to a bunch of leaders and you say, are you leaders or managers? You really need them to err on the side of leadership, because leadership is about vision. It's about helping people to follow your vision. It's about being able to inspire people, to motivate people, to explain why things are important. That's leadership. And so leading through change, you've got to be able to do things like, how do you manage complexity? How do you manage uncertainty? How do you lead people, but in a grown-up kind of way where you don't, the idea of, especially in America, sort of optimism, positive thinking is a huge industry. But if you don't do it in a grown-up way, it's not very believable.
Right.
So being able to lead in a kind of mature, rational, but kind of sensitive way is the best way to get people to change with you. So that's kind of group one. There are 4 groups. Group 2 is, as I've talked about, is critical thinking. And it's amazing how critical thinking, as soon as COVID hit, all of our clients were saying, we need help with critical thinking. And what was interesting is, well, why didn't you need this before? We'd had this on the shelf for ages and no one was interested. And then suddenly, and I think it was because there was a little bit of paralysis from people. They didn't know what to do. And so it's like, how do we solve problems? How do we make decisions? The third one is what we call future communication. And that's about working with AI. How do you integrate AI into your life? How do you manage with AI? How do you communicate with AI? How do you allow AI to work alongside you without it, almost like sucking the life out of kind of the relationships you have? So that was kind of the kind of third element. And then the last element is something we call social wellbeing. And I think, Dan will speak to this. This is, the core of our book, really, because all of these added together is kind of what we like to think. And actually, I think this is really important, Dan, at this stage, maybe to talk about some of the fantastic and fascinating academic papers that we found that really communicate this problem, because we really wanted to come in with the receipts, with the evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And we feel we've definitely done that. So I don't know, Dan, if you want to explain something.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, sure thing. I hope that's okay, Blaine. We're just going to
Oh,
keep going.
absolutely.
But
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, the tagline on the book, is organized around social well-being. So I want to be sure
right,
to
yeah, well,
bundle.
so well, as Nick says, that's the spine of the book and of the ideas that that Nick had been developing over many years, and I came late to the party and had to bring a little shape to them and help with some of the research. And in the course of the research, I was looking at academic papers and business papers, business research, looking at leading writers and thinkers. And what amazed me in looking back at this research that had been published over 30 years, that it didn't matter which direction you approached it from. You're looking at team dynamics or the physiological needs for people had for well-being at work, Maslow and so on. It didn't really matter whether you're just looking at personal needs for well-being or where you started, but all the research came back to just a tiny subset of values. Different papers, different academics, from Anita Woolley and others looking at collective intelligence, through to work on psychological safety, through to work, Paul Zak working on trust. The same set of values came back, and everyone kept coming back to the same values. And there were four major ones. And as I say, they were psychological safety, they were trust, they were respect, and they were a sense of belonging. And if you can bring these things to bear, we realized, then what you're doing then is you're helping not just a few individuals who imagine well-being to be a trip to yoga on a Wednesday lunchtime, or maybe doing some mindfulness, or maybe indulging in the free coffee down in the lobby. Maybe you need a strategy for well-being that brings in the whole workforce and touches everybody. And the only thing that does that is culture. And the best way to do that, the best culture to look at, to give you some certainty, some confidence, some reliability, some stability, especially in uncertain times, like as we find ourselves now, is to develop a culture that touches everybody. And the culture that you want that touches everybody is something that brings everybody together. If you bring teamwork together, encourage collaboration, your group is collectively more intelligent. And you do that through psychological safety, trust, and respect. And doing that means people feel able to speak up in a meeting, that because they feel there's more belonging. These things all tie in with each other. You're bringing people together in a social approach to well-being. Social well-being, it's a good approach to culture, and culture is the best approach to maintaining stability, we think.
What's the pragmatic consequence for a business of ensuring that social well-being is foremost in the leader's focus?
Well, I think this needs to be explained to leaders. And interesting, some of the work I'm doing. So, for example, I'm going to New York in about 3 weeks. And one of the reasons I'm there is to talk to senior leadership at a particular organization so they can understand the research behind what we're talking about. So, for example, they're all getting a copy of the book. And I'm going to be revealing some of the data, some of the science, and explain how it all ties together. Because ultimately, if you get this right, the data suggests that companies are more profitable, but also the retention is supercharged. People want to stay. I mean, the main reason people say they stay in a business are the people.
Yeah.
It's not because they get a great salary, because salaries are going to be roughly in the same zone wherever you go for your expertise. But relationships are priceless. And so if you can cultivate that sense of team and people feel honored or excited to express themselves. Remember, a lot of people in the knowledge economy went to university, they've got degrees, and they sit there silently in meetings, not really contributing. You're not going to go home and say, honey, how was your day at work? And you say, well, I didn't do a lot. I sat in the meeting, I twiddled my thumbs, I went back to my workstation and I came home. That's not exciting. But if you say I went to work, we had this amazing meeting where we got creative and I had this really cool idea, and then suddenly you start to talk about what a great time you had at work. And as a result, the business gets all of you.
Yeah.
And there's evidence that all of you and all of your colleagues are contributing, which creates that collective intelligence that Dan was talking about. And most importantly, and I think the big word that I want everyone to take away is trust. These behaviors breed trust, and trust breeds a healthy workplace.
Spot on. Leadership is a relational activity. That's all it is. And all any organization is a collection of people that are in relationship with each other. At the end of the day, that's all you got is relationship. And early on in our conversation, you mentioned, leading through change. And part of what happens with change is a disruption to existing relationships that the change causes. And that's where the problem actually begins to appear, because, the question, who am I, where do I belong, is a relational question. Work process changes, AI comes in and disrupts, whatever. I mean, all of that has at the foundation a relational component to it. And you're speaking, in a very broad sense here of culture. Last question I've got for both of you here has to do with this nature of culture. And typically, and I'm just going to put this in the context of a mid-sized company, not necessarily a small company where there's, under 20 employees or something like that, but a larger organization where you've got 100 people or more. There's an HR function, and what is the charter that HR should adopt for itself in order to make sure that the culture is facilitating the kind of engagement that we want with our people? And I ask this question because, in my experience, most HR functions in most companies are organized around compliance, and they are not seen as strategic partners by the leaders in the organization. So what's the role that an HR professional could begin to carve out for themselves?
Right. Firstly, when it comes to compliance, that is very much a post-2008 thing. A huge slice of the training pie went to compliance because that was the law. I get that. But I would say if any HR people are listening, you have to be good at communicating to the business. You've done the work, you've done the research, you know what the business needs, especially from a human perspective. But sometimes the business is difficult to get through to because they're focused on KPIs, quarterly results, etc. So being able to make your case is the most useful thing you could do. And then bring in experts who can support your business in a way that will bring all your talents to fruition.
Right. Dan?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's the point here about social well-being. As we were saying before, it applies across the workforce. If you're looking to tackle things like the disengagement, Blaine, that you mentioned right at the top of the show, or you're looking to tackle fatigue or even burnout, or maybe the uncertainty that we're all experiencing some of now, the best approach is really to bring the business together, really, than to find division. If there is division between the business and the HR, where HR is saying, well, we have a well-being initiative, and the business are kind of like busy focused on KPIs and focused on the numbers. Blaine, like you were saying, some businesses might be focused on the numbers and on the results and less on the people themselves. And yet there's some disengagement, and the business are saying, well, HR, it's their responsibility to fix it. Go find a well-being solution and bring in a mindfulness guy or something. Then that's not really the harmony that you're really looking for, I guess. I think that maybe the best thing that a business can do is come together and look at the culture that they have and look at it right from the top, and so that it works its way through the entirety of the business and touches everybody. I think that would be a good way to go.
Magic. That's spot on. Guys, we're coming close to, we are at the point where we need to end. I would love to have you back on. I mean, this is a conversation that, 30 minutes does not do justice to. So, I'll have my team reach back out to your PR people and see if we can get something else set up in another couple of months or so here.
Thank you. We really
I
appreciate
love this
it.
conversation. I think it's timely. I think it's, the import of this is crazy. And I'll just cite some, a statistic here that actually, your people sent this to me. Worldwide, the cost of employee disengagement in terms of lost productivity has reached almost $9 trillion a year, which is equal to 9% plus of the global GDP. And employees that have, or organizations that have highly engaged workers actually report 23% higher profitability than those that don't. So that's kind of the period at the end of this conversation right now. There's a cost to not paying attention to this, folks. And there is a definite reward on the other side if you are beginning to look at how can we actually create a humane workplace, which is what compassionate capitalism is all about. Everybody's connected. It's all about relationship. So, Nick, I want to thank you. Dan, I want to thank you. This has been a fascinating conversation, folks. I'm going to hold the book up again here. If you're watching it, you'll see it. If you're not watching it, I'll just read it. The book is called Engaging Teams, How to Use Social Wellbeing to Boost Performance, Retention, and Culture. This is a great read. There is some wonderful information in there, and it's well written too. It's actually well written. So it's an engaging book. Gentlemen, thank you very much. And I look forward to return engagement.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Blaine. Really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. And folks, you've been listening to The Soul of Business with Blaine Bartlett. This is Blaine Bartlett. As always, I want you to find a way in your life to find ways to be acting as if you are a center of distribution, not a center of accumulation. And you look at nature, there is nothing in nature that thrives or even survives long term if it is solely focused on accumulation. Find ways in your life to give things away. A hug, a smile, drop something into a hat that somebody's holding out. Just find a way to connect. We're all human. Nature works this way, and each of us is a part of nature. So my admonition to you is act as if you're a part of nature. Be healthy, thrive. And I'll see you on the next episode. Take care. This episode is sponsored by The Power of You, a leadership resource for entrepreneurs, solopreneurs, and anyone intent on developing their leadership impact and supercharging their career. For more information, check the podcast webpage or show notes. Hi, I'd like to ask you to do something for me if you wouldn't mind. If you like this episode, I'd like you to not only subscribe on your favorite site, but I'd also like you to give a rating. Ideally, a 5-star rating would be greatly appreciated. But I think more importantly also would be just some comments. That helps with the algorithm and it helps build the audience with this. And more than anything else, if you could invite somebody else to listen, just share this episode with a friend, with a colleague. And I'd like to see how we can grow the soul of business. I think it makes a difference. Thanks.